The food issue is the issue that gives me nightmares because I don't see a way to fix it. It takes 10 years to bring a new potash production facility online. And the Canadians got started as soon as the war began back in March. Well, I mean, they started in March, the war started in February. But they're hoping they can speed it up and get meaningful replacement volumes up by 2029. We only had a disruption out of the Russian space for fertilizer production of about 1/3. And Mother Nature was very kind to us the world over. Most of the world's farmers had great weather all year long. And everyone had a fertilizer reserve. Well, the amount of stuff that is getting broken down in the Russian system is accelerating. Mother Nature is probably going to be her normal self next year.
Yeah.
The initial forecasts, especially for the Western Hemisphere, don't look great. And everyone has already used their reserves. So we should expect significant fertilizer shortages sometime in 2023. The country to watch is Brazil, because they're the world's largest fertilizer importer. And they're a big enough country, they've got the heft to get it. And if they start having problems, you know that there are dozens of smaller countries out there that are already in crisis point. So we'll probably see significant drops in agricultural output next year, especially in the second half of next year, which should suggest that we're going to have significant problems with food supply on a global scale in the months that follow. Sure. So greater NAFTA, US, Canada, Mexico is obviously at the top of the list. Colombia, Australia, Japan, and assuming they can get their head out of their ass, the Brits, are probably going to be part of the new network that works. And most of the Western Hemisphere that was not on that list is at a minimum going to be able to benefit from a relatively placid security environment. So they're not going to be dealing with a lot of the changes that are happening in the Eastern Hemisphere. In fact, a lot of these countries are commodities exporters. And so in that sort of environment where your commodities can still be produced, assuming you get the fertilizer, but you don't have to worry about a security concern, your ability to sell high is very promising. The biggest loser by far is China. Everything about China's functionality is dependent on a globalization and a demographic moment that has passed. And they are definitely not going to survive as a country, much less as an economy. I think we're in the final decade of the European Union, because without that Russian energy, there is no German manufacturing model. And without the German manufacturing model, you don't have the money that is used to keep the EU in existence. So, I mean, can you imagine what would happen with the Greek debt crisis if the Germans didn't have the capacity to write a check? That's the environment we're going to be in a few years. Add in terminal demographics, and parts of Europe can go their own way and be reasonably successful. Scandinavia, I'm very bullish on. France, I'm very bullish on, but the rest of it looks really, really dangerous. Wow. And then I am really concerned about Sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, because they import almost every speck of their potash and their phosphate and their nitrogen fertilizer, and their food importers on top of that. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean state failure. India is a great example of a country that can sustain a very high degree of chaos and just keep on chugging along. But most countries in this part of the world are not as strong as India. We're going to have an interesting realignment of what is normal in the United States over the next 20 years. Because we've had this populist rise up represented by Biden and Trump, but we're also going to be probably taking in 40 or 50 million migrants over the course of the next 20, 25 years.
Wow.
That is going to change our complexion, because these are not going to be people who walked here. These are going to be people mostly from advanced countries with degrees and experience who can have an immediate value-added impact that is quite a bit different from our normal immigrant draw. We've had a really good run the last 75 years. It was never going to last. That doesn't necessarily mean it had to collapse in the way that it's going to, though, and it's going to be a rough ride. We have phosphate shortages because the Chinese are terrified about food shortages, so they've blocked all exports. That's going to last for at least the rest of this year, probably all of next year as well. We have a nitrogen fertilizer shortage because nitrogen fertilizer is synthesized from natural gas. We were already looking at high natural gas prices nearing record levels before the Russian invasion, and Russia is also the world's largest exporter. So a lot of fertilizer producers for nitrogen have already stopped operating in Europe because they can't afford the gas anymore. And then 40% of the world's potash comes from either Belarus or Russia, and that has now been stopped.
Right.
So we're looking at a chronic shortage globally of all three, and we know that means that a lot of poorer farmers around the world are not going to use fertilizer or not going to use enough. And for everyone else, it's going to just be the single largest line item for them, so they're not going to be able to afford to do anything else. So we are looking at the beginning of a multi-year food shortage, multi-continental in scope, this year. And of course, Ukraine is going from the world's 5th largest exporter to a net importer, and it will not come back for at least a decade. You're right, Canada is where we get most of our potash. We produce most of the nitrogen ourselves, and the phosphates that we don't source within North America either come from Morocco or Israel, and those supplies are safe. But remember, there is no tool to cut off American food exports, so food, at least for now, is still in a semi-globalized environment. And in that environment, you're going to feel the pain, but it's not like we're going to be dealing with food lines or food shortages here in the way that sub-Saharan Africa or maybe South Asia, maybe parts of China, and definitely the Middle East. We're talking about food price increases that are significantly higher. We only had a tripling of food prices in the Middle East the last time we had any sort of disruption. This is going to be at least twice as bad. Yeah, I mean, Russia's primary export market is the Middle East. Ukraine's secondary market is the Middle East. That's just not happening this year, and that's independent of the fertilizer program. That's a big part of my life right now, is just figuring out how long it's going to take to get replacement systems up online. And I'm not done, but spoiler alert, you're talking a minimum of 5 years. You break down globalization. What this whole talk is just a very small part of it. You break that down, and we've exceeded the pre-industrial carrying capacity of the planet. It's only with fertilizers that we're able to keep 8 billion people alive. And so if you remove the industrial level inputs that allow that to happen, we will have famine. It will be worst in the Middle East, probably second worst in China, because that system hasn't fully broken down yet. And then it's a toss-up for number 3 between sub-Saharan Africa and India, Pakistan. And the only reason that India and Pakistan, I think, are going to come out of this okay is with the first stop out of the Persian Gulf. So oil, natural gas, they're okay-ish. And they have, on multiple occasions, shown that if they just throw a bottomless supply of people at their agricultural sector, they can get sufficient production by substituting labor for fertilizer. Now, that has other economic problems, but it does mean that mass famine can be avoided to a degree. India, some of the decisions that the Indians have made over the last 50 years that we look at as just economically silly, like every time the farmers throw a fit, they back away from whatever the modernization program was. And that has always been dumb in a globalized world. In a non-globalized world, that's actually pretty smart. I like to say that India has looked more or less like it has today since the time of the 5th century AD in the Hindu kingdoms. And nothing as small as the end of the world is going to change how India functions. This is just India. In the West, what we think of as the geography of agriculture is changing radically, because they're shutting down nitrogen fertilizer fabrication in Europe because they can't get the natural gas at a price point that makes sense. And then, of course, phosphate is from the east, and potash is from the other side of a new iron curtain. So you're looking at the European continent and all of the former European colonies having to radically overhaul how they even decide agriculture functions and how energy functions. And we're only in the very, very beginning of that unwinding. And so if you have an American president who thinks he can ban the export of crude oil in order to protect American consumers from high oil prices, they'll absolutely do it. So we can have a floor on prices here of about 70 and a ceiling here of about 70, and a floor everywhere else is at least 150, probably closer to 200.